The first thing you need to understand about humans is that they don't signal weakness the way everyone else does. Every species we've catalogued, every one, has a biological tell. The Vreth flatten their crests. The Solani go still in a way that's almost meditative. Even us, the Kailori, we breathe differently when something scares us. It's involuntary. It's honest. Humans, they smile. I know. I've read the briefs. I know what the research says about the biomechanical function of it. The social roots, the thing about submission displays repurposed over millennia into something else entirely. I've read it 3 times. I still don't feel prepared when it happens in front of me. So when Instructor Veth Karal, a veteran of the Corridor Wars, a being who once held a defensive line for 19 hours with a fractured exoskeleton and half a squad, when he went quiet in the middle of a training exercise, I checked my timestamps. 09:14:33. He didn't speak again for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and I was the only one in that hangar who understood why. This is the log of second-rank observer Suri Ellen Voss, attached to the Human Integration Assessment Unit, Compound 7. I am required by regulation to note that my professional assessment of the subject contained herein remains objective. I am also required by regulation to note when I believe my own log entry to be inaccurate. So, I timestamp everything. It's a compulsion my bunk assignment Drea finds insufferable. She has mentioned this 11 times. I have timestamped each mention. This seems to confirm her point, but I've decided that's her problem. It started during the Yenna skirmish. I was an auxiliary signals officer, barely out of certification, and I lost 4 hours of a battle I couldn't account for later. Not in my memory, not in my notes. 4 hours simply gone, and when the debrief came, I had nothing to offer. No data. No sequence. The feeling of standing in that room with empty hands is one I have decided never to repeat. So I timestamp. The human arrived at Compound 7 at 6:02:14 on a transit shuttle that smelled, according to my notes, like industrial lubricant and something I can only describe as sweet decay. A smell I later learned was a human food product called a protein bar, which their soldiers eat with apparent enthusiasm and which I suspect may be their version of a war crime. Her name was Specialist Yara Voss. She was not what I expected. I don't know precisely what I expected. The integration briefings use the word formidable a great deal in relation to human soldiers, in the particular way that word gets used when the writer is technically being accurate but privately terrified. I had absorbed the briefings. I had prepared myself for formidable. Voss was 1.71 meters tall. That's not remarkable. Her shoulders were broad, but not unusually so. She had brown skin that was currently doing something interesting in the compound's blue spectrum lighting, going a warm amber at the cheekbones. And her hair was cropped so close to her skull that I initially misread it as a biomechanical modification before I checked the file. She was carrying a bag that was clearly too heavy for one person to carry casually, and she was carrying it casually. That should have been the first note. I wrote it down at 6:02:31. Bag. Heavy. Casual. And then I timestamped it and went back to watching the intake queue. She cleared processing in 11 minutes. That was fast. Most soldiers, regardless of species, spend at least 20 minutes at intake, usually longer. The processing staff tends to have questions. Forms require completion. There is invariably something missing. Voss handed over a documentation chip, answered 3 questions, signed 2 things, and walked out. The processing officer, a young Kailori named Tem, stared after her for a long moment. Then he looked at me across the hall, because I was the integration observer assigned to this intake and therefore technically responsible for noting anomalies. He mouthed, "That fast?" I timestamped 06:13:07. Anomaly. Intake speed. Category, minor. Then I followed her to the equipment bay. The equipment bay at Compound 7 is where the first misunderstandings usually happen. The multi-species training accord, which is what gave me this job, technically specifies that integrated training facilities must provide species-appropriate gear for all participants. It's a good policy. It means that Vreth soldiers get the joint support exoframes their physiology requires, Solani get the temperature-regulated panels. The Rethi get the low-gravity compensation cushions they throw a scene about if not provided. Humans get a gear locker. This is not dismissive. The humans specifically requested a locker. The reasoning, per the equipment liaison notes, was that humans prefer to assess available materials themselves and that pre-assignment was, direct quote, a little presumptuous. I remember reading that and thinking, odd. Voss went to the locker. She stood in front of it for about 40 seconds, which I time-stamped but didn't assign a category to yet because I didn't know what category to assign. Then she started pulling things out. She did not pull out a weapon first. She pulled out a pair of gloves. They were not standard issue anything. They were. I checked with the equipment catalogue later 3 times. Not in the catalogue at all. They appeared to be made from something thick and dark-coloured, with strange ridging across the palm side and individual articulated fingers, reinforced at the knuckle. They were battered. The left thumb's reinforcement was worn almost through. There was something written on the inside of the right wrist cuff in a neat hand that I could not read from my position and which I spent the next 20 minutes wanting to read with an intensity that I found professionally embarrassing. She put them on with the practiced ease of someone doing a thing they have done 10,000 times. Then she stood there, flexed her fingers, twice, went back to assessing the locker. Private Heth Khan, one of the Kalori recruits in intake alongside her, was watching from 3 meters away. Heth Khan has what my colleague Dreyer calls an underdeveloped social editor, meaning he says things out loud that most people recognize, correctly, as thoughts that should stay internal. He said in a carrying voice, "What are those for?" Voss glanced at him. "Temperature regulation. It's climate-controlled in here." "Yep." She went back to the locker. Heth Khan looked at the soldier beside him, a Rethi named Osivan, who had the specific expression of someone trying very hard not to be associated with a nearby social disaster, and said, less quietly than before, "Temperature regulation in a climate-controlled facility." Osivan said nothing. A Vreth soldier on Heth Khan's other side. I didn't have his name yet. I logged him as Vreth1 until I got it. Made a sound that, in Vreth, roughly translates to the noise you make when something is both funny and slightly pathetic. Heth Khan laughed. Not cruelly. He wasn't being cruel, I want to be clear about that. He was 23 years old and doing what 23-year-olds do in a new and nerve-wracking environment, which is find a thing to laugh at so they have something to stand on. Voss didn't react. She found whatever she was looking for in the locker, a coil of something fibrous and thin, at which she wound around her left forearm twice and secured, and walked out of the equipment bay toward the training floor. I logged 064155. Subject, gloves. Category, unknown. Follow up. Instructor Veth Karal ran the morning assessment. He's been at Compound 7 for 6 years. Before that, Corridor Wars. Before that, the Kelthine Suppression, which is the kind of thing that goes on your record as a credential, and also, if you look at the person who has it, and as an explanation for certain silences. He is not a warm instructor. He is an effective one. The morning assessment was a diagnostic obstacle course, not designed to be passed on the first attempt, designed to generate data on how recruits handle failure, which is a different thing. The course was set up in Hangar 4, a 7-stage sequence involving physical obstacles, a timed navigation section, and one staged environmental hazard near the end that would cut power to the recruits' tactical overlays for approximately 90 seconds. The power cut is the point. You want to see what they do when their information goes dark. Veth Karal gave the briefing in front of 12 recruits. Standard procedure, parameters, timing, hazards, and the phrase he uses at the end of every briefing, which I'd been told about beforehand, the course is a mirror, not a test. Meaning, it shows you what you are. It doesn't grade you, in theory. In practice, the times are logged and ranked and absolutely function as grades. The recruits lined up. I was in the observation gallery above, behind the secondary glass, with my timestamp pad and a cup of what the compound's canteen produced when asked for strong black coffee by a Kalori who had been reading human sustenance files and decided to try it. It was, I need to be accurate here, not good. It tasted like someone had boiled a bad decision in water and served it hot. I have had 4 cups since. This is a problem I am filing under integration side effects and declining to examine further. The course began at 090217. The early stages went predictably. Recruits sorted themselves. The Vreth excelled on the upper body stages, as their upper limb configuration gave them leverage advantages. The Rethi, Osivan specifically, had a clean run on the navigation section, which didn't surprise me. Rethi spatial processing is exceptional. Heth Khan hit Stage 3's momentum puzzle and stalled, which also didn't surprise me. He was reading the puzzle as a strength problem when it was actually a timing one. Voss went through the first 3 stages without anything I could timestamp as remarkable. Stage 4 was the friction wall, a near vertical surface with inconsistent grip point spacing, and designed to require recruits to find their own path rather than follow a preset one. Most species with multi-digit hands do reasonably well on it. Most. She hit the wall and stopped. Not in defeat. She stood at the base of it and just looked at it. Her head moved slightly, left to right, in a scanning pattern that I recognized from the biomechanics files as a human behavior called visual problem decomposition, though I only remembered the term 3 minutes later when I went looking for it. Then she put her hands on the wall. The gloves. They hit the friction surface and, this is difficult to describe in a way that gives it appropriate weight, they stayed. Not grip-assisted stay. Not the passive contact of a hand on a surface. They stayed the way a decision stays, deliberately, with intent behind it. She went up that wall like she'd built it. The path she chose was not the obvious path. It avoided the 3 highest density grip points entirely. I didn't understand why until Stage 5, when I realized she'd been looking ahead, conserving the wear pattern on those gloves, protecting whatever material quality they had because she'd already calculated that she'd need them again. She cleared Stage 4 in 31 seconds. The stage record was 44. I wrote 091112. Stage 4. 31 seconds. Gloves. Functional. Category. I stopped. I didn't have a category. Stage 6 was where the power cut happened, and the tactical overlays went dark at 091355. I have it to the second. What recruits typically do in the 90-second blackout? Freeze, backtrack, move cautiously and too slowly, occasionally panic. What Voss did, nothing changed. She was mid-stage when the lights dropped, moving through a corridor section of the course with low ceiling obstacles, and she continued. Same pace, same deliberateness. Her hands went to the walls on either side, not grabbing, just light contact, like a reader running fingertips over text. The gloves again. Veth Karal was watching from the floor-level observation position. I couldn't see his face from where I was, but I could see his posture change. He had been standing with his secondary arms folded across his midsection, his default observing posture, the one he'd had the whole morning, the folded arms stance. At 091402, 7 seconds into the blackout, his secondary arms dropped. He took 1 step forward toward the course barrier. Stopped himself. The lights came back up at 091425. 30 seconds of blackout instead of 90. Veth Karal had cut it short. I know this because I know the scheduled duration and I timestamp things, and also because Veth Karal himself later told me it wasn't deliberate. He'd been so focused, he'd triggered the manual override without meaning to. He didn't tell me that until much later. In the moment, I just saw him cut the blackout. Voss emerged from the corridor section, saw the lights were back, and she looked up at Veth Karal. Not at the course, not at the next stage. At him. And she smiled. It was not the submission display. I know the research. I'd read it 3 times. This was something else. It was the smile that means I see you seeing me. And it sat on her face for about 2 seconds before she turned back to the course. Veth Karal went quiet. 09:14:33. I wrote it down. He didn't speak for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know because I timed it. He stood there and he watched her finish the last stage, and the only sound from him was a very quiet exhalation when she hit the finish mark that I had to strain to hear through the observation glass. The other recruits finished in stages. Osivan was second. Heth Khan, eventually, fourth. The debrief was standard. Veth Karal ran through each stage, the things he'd noted, and the adjustments recruits would need to make. His voice was level, professional. He had the whole thing back under control. Until Heth Khan, being Heth Khan, said, "Why did she wear those gloves the whole time? The course has standard grip equipment at every stage." Veth Karal looked at Heth Khan. Then he looked at Voss. She was in the back row of the assembled recruits, rewrapping the fibrous coil around her forearm. She hadn't looked up. Veth Karal said, "They're not grip equipment." Heth Khan waited for more. More didn't come. Then what are they? Veth Karal, for the second time that morning, went quiet. He was looking at Voss. She was still looking at her own forearm, methodical and unhurried, and the gloves were visible on her hands, the worn left thumb, whatever was written inside the right wrist cuff. He said, "Dismissed," and walked out. I cornered Dreyer in the canteen afterward because she'd been on floor-level observation for a different intake group, and I needed to process this out loud at someone. She was eating, something gelatinous and blue that she insists is comforting. I sat across from her with my bad coffee and said, "The instructor cut the blackout short." Dreyer said, He cut it at 30 seconds instead of 90. I heard. He didn't mean to. She looked up at me. How do you know he didn't mean to? He told me. He told you. I asked him. Dreyer put down her spoon. Sorry? Why did you ask the instructor whether he accidentally shortcut his own exercise? Because I wanted to know. That's not... You can't just... She stopped, rubbed the ridge above her left eye. What exactly did he say? I checked my notes. He said, and I'm reading this verbatim, I needed to see if she could navigate without the light. She could. I didn't need the other 60 seconds. Dreyer stared at me. He didn't need the other 60 seconds, I repeated, meaning he already had his answer. At 7 seconds. At 7 seconds. She picked up her spoon again, set it down, picked it up. What was she doing at 7 seconds? Moving. Same pace. Hands on the walls. The gloves? The gloves. We sat with that for a moment. And I said, he's been running that course for 6 years. I know. I checked the compound records. 417 recruits go through that blackout stage. Dreyer said, and at 7 seconds, he already had his answer. Yes. She looked at her food. What does that tell you? It tells me a lot of things, I thought. It tells me that whatever Veth Karal saw at 7 seconds was not a variable he'd encountered in 417 previous data points. It tells me that something in those 7 seconds resolved a question he didn't know he was asking. It tells me that the gloves are not about temperature regulation, and they're not about grip, and whatever they are about is written in small, neat letters on the inside of the right wrist cuff in a language I can't read from the observation gallery. I wrote it down in my notes. All of it. Time-stamped it. 09:48:29. What I said to Dreyer was, I don't know yet. She looked at me in a way that suggested she didn't believe me, which was accurate. But I'm going to find out, I said. Of course you are, she said, and went back to her blue food. Voss was in the equipment bay again when I went back there after dinner. It was 19:23:11. The bay was mostly empty. Most recruits had the evening allocated as personal time, She was at the bench by the far wall with the gloves laid out flat in front of her and a small kit of tools I didn't recognize beside them. She was repairing the left thumb. I stood in the doorway for a moment, which I'm including here for accuracy because it's relevant to my state of objectivity. I was making a choice about whether to approach, and I was not making it quickly. Then I walked in. She didn't look up. She was working with something small and precise on the thumb seam, and her attention was entirely on it in the way that attention gets when a task is both familiar and requires care. I said, "The left thumb seam." She said, "Yep. Stage 4. She looked up at that. Not surprised, just checking something. "You were watching." "I'm the integration observer." "Right." She went back to the repair. Stage 4, Stage 5, and the corridor section. The corridor section was the worst for it. Because of the wall contact. Yeah. She tied off something in the seam, tested it with her thumb, tied it again. They're not rated for that kind of lateral pressure for that long. They weren't made for an obstacle course. I sat on the bench across from her, not asking permission, just sitting. She didn't object. What were they made for? She was quiet for a moment. "Previous deployment," she said. I waited. And that was all she gave me. I looked at the right wrist cuff, the writing visible now from this distance, but still not readable in this light. I said, "What does it say?" She turned the cuff toward me. 4 words in human script. Standard Terran block letters. I can read Terran script. It's in the observer certification requirements. It said, "Don't stop. Don't stop." I looked at it for a while. She said, "Someone wrote it for me before the last deployment. Because I have a tendency to." She paused. "Stop." Then she folded the cuff over, picked up the gloves, and put them back on. "They work," she said. "That's the thing. Everyone thinks they're—" She glanced up. "I heard Heth Khan. He wasn't being cruel." "I know." She flexed her fingers, testing the repair. "They always think it's about something you can see. Grip or temperature or whatever. It's not. What's it about?" She looked at the gloves. "They slow my hands down," she said. "So, just slightly. When my hands go fast, it means I'm panicking. The gloves make me deliberate." She stood up, collected the kit. "Instructor Corral," she said. "He cut the Blackout short." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about what Veth Corral had said. I needed to see if she could navigate without the light. She could. I didn't need the other 60 seconds. I said, "He already had his answer." She looked at me, and something in her face shifted, just slightly, in a way I couldn't name, and did not attempt to name in my notes, because some things are not served by categorization. Then she nodded once and left. I stayed on the bench for a while, looked at the empty toolkit she'd left behind. Wrote 1941-08. Subject, gloves. Functional. Category. I stopped again. Wrote, "Don't stop. Don't stop." Then I time-stamped it and closed the log. The second week was when things got complicated. Not complicated in the way that integration assessment usually gets complicated. Not the paperwork and protocol kind, not the interspecies friction that turns into a formal grievance at the end of week 3, which is so statistically reliable that the compound has a template for it. That kind of complicated, I know. I have 47 timestamps associated with template grievances from previous rotations. This was something else. It started, as things at Compound 7 often do, is with a scenario exercise, 073951. Hangar 2. The scenario was called a live friction drill in the official documentation, which is a name designed to be boring so recruits don't over-prepare. What it actually involves? 12 recruits divided into 2 teams, a contested objective, in this case, a sealed container positioned in the center of the hangar floor, and enough ambient obstacles to make a straight-line approach interesting. There are no weapons. There are no stakes beyond the record. There is also, and this is the part Veth Corral never mentions in the briefing, a secondary observer team watching from a separate gallery, running their own assessment of team dynamics. That secondary observer team was Wraithy officers from the Inter-Coalition Evaluation Board, which is exactly the kind of thing that gets into your permanent record if you're a recruit and does not get mentioned to you so that your behaviour can be evaluated naturally. I mention this because it's relevant, and because Dreyer found out about the secondary observers at 074117 and immediately started stress-eating her blue food in the gallery. "They're evaluating the whole compound," she said. "Not just the recruits. The instruction methodology. Carral's numbers." I wrote 0741:44. Secondary observers. Present. Veth Carral. Unaware. Then, correction. Possibly unaware. Then I looked at Veth Carral on the floor below us, who was standing with the exact stillness of a person who knows they're being watched and has decided to behave as though they aren't. And I crossed out possibly and wrote nothing. Team assignment was Voss, Heth Khan, Ossivan, and 3 others I'll call by their species, Vreth 2, Vreth 3, Rethi 2. Opposing team was a deliberate contrast. Heavier, faster on average, with 2 recruits who'd been flagged in week 1 as high performers in physical assessment. Veth Carral didn't assign a leader. So this was notable. Typically, there's a designated lead. It gives you a clean line of accountability and a clear data point for leadership assessment. Not this time. I wrote 0751:03. No designated lead. Deliberate? Category: watch. The drill started. The opposing team moved on the objective immediately. Standard aggressive approach: split, flank, converge. Clean, fast. It should have worked. Voss's team didn't move. Heth Khan, to his credit, he managed not to say anything out loud for almost 10 seconds. Then, "Are we?" "Yep," Voss said, "because they're..." "I know. They're going to reach..." "Heth." He went quiet. She was watching the opposing team with that left-right scan, the visual decomposition thing. Her hands were loose at her sides. The gloves were on. They were always on. I had not seen her without them in 11 days now. And she was completely, almost unnervingly still. The opposing team reached the objective. Touched it. Looked at each other. Looked at Voss's team. Voss's team still hadn't moved. One of the opposing recruits, Vreth 2 opposing, I'll call him, to distinguish, made a sound. Not quite the same sound as week 1. Something more contemptuous than that. Heth Khan's jaw tightened. I could see it from the gallery. Voss said, very quietly, "Vreth 2. Vreth 2 on her team said, "Yes. You and Rethi 2. Go right. Slowly." Pause. How slowly? Like you're not going anywhere. Vreth 2 and Rethi 2 began moving right. Slowly. As though they were bored. Voss said, "Ossivan." "Ossivan, here." "Go left. Same thing." "I don't..." "What are we doing?" "Breathing room," Voss said. "I need 20 seconds." Ossivan went left. Slowly. Like it didn't matter. The opposing team watched this with the specific confusion of people who had already won and didn't understand why the other side was still moving. Beheth Khan and Vreth 3 remained with Voss. Voss stood still for 19 more seconds. I counted. Then she said, "Heth, the left panel, the one that's been vibrating since the drill started." I looked at the left panel. There was a structural support running floor to ceiling, and at about 2 meters up, there was a ventilation panel that had, in fact, been vibrating slightly since the drill began. I had noted it at 075244 and filed it as an environmental quirk. The Heth Khan said, "What about it? When we start moving, you're going to hit it." "Why would I hit a ventilation panel?" "Because I need it to be loud." A pause. "Loud," Heth Khan said. "As loud as you can make it without stopping." Heth Khan looked at the panel, looked at Voss. A thing passed across his face that I have time-stamped but don't have a category for. The expression of someone who doesn't understand a plan but has decided, on some level below reason, to trust it. "Okay," he said. They moved. The noise was extraordinary. Heth Khan hit that panel like it had insulted his family. A single sustained metallic crash that bounced off every surface in Hangar 2, and in the half-second that it took the opposing team to process the sound and look toward it, Voss was already 3 meters closer to the objective. Not running, not charging. Moving in a controlled, deliberate way that covered ground faster than it should have, and the gloves were against the floor for one beat as she used a low obstacle as a pivot point. The opposing team reacted. Of course they did. But the half-second was gone, and they were recalculating position from where she'd been rather than where she was, and Vreth 3 was coming from a different angle. And by the time the full picture assembled for the opposing team, there was a gap in their formation that hadn't been there 20 seconds ago. Osivan went through it. Osivan didn't touch the objective. Osivan stood next to the objective, one hand raised, not quite touching it, looking at the lead opposing recruit, who looked back at him. The whole hangar went quiet. It is not touching the objective that matters, Voss had explained this. I didn't understand it until this moment. It is being able to touch it. It is standing close enough to touch it that every second the opposing team spends not conceding is a second they're choosing to test whether your team can be stopped. The opposing lead was calculating. I could see it from the gallery. He was running the scenario. Move toward Osivan. Osivan touches the objective. Drill ends. Don't move. Osivan stands there, and the drill becomes a standoff. He moved toward Osivan. Voss touched the objective from the other side. The drill ended at 8:09:17. Is 17 minutes and 26 seconds. The debrief was unusual, not because of anything Veth Karol said. He ran it the same way he always ran them, methodical and specific, noting what worked and what hadn't. It was unusual because of the secondary observers, who were now very visibly writing things down and had stopped pretending they were here for a general evaluation. They were watching Veth Karol. He knew. I could tell by the way he'd straightened the cadence of his sentences, and they put a fraction more formality into his phrasing. 6 years running this compound, and he still did it, became slightly more formal when assessed, the way almost everyone does. The recruits didn't know about the observers. They were looking at each other with the particular post-exercise energy of people trying to understand what they'd just done. Heth Khan said, "The panel." Voss said, "Yeah." "You were counting the vibrations." "Yes." "For how long?" She thought about it. "And since we walked in." Heth Khan stared at her. "You counted the vibrations from a ventilation panel, from the start of the drill, so that you'd know how loud it would be when someone hit it." Voss said, "The interval was consistent, so the sound would be consistent. I needed to know how much disorientation we could buy." "Half a second," he said. "Half a second was enough." Heth Khan was quiet for a moment. "I thought the gloves were for temperature regulation," he said. It wasn't quite an apology. It was the thing underneath an apology, the acknowledgement that lives between "I was wrong" and the actual saying of it. "I've seen Kalori do it. I've done it myself." Voss looked at him. "They're for not stopping," she said. He nodded. "I wrote 083145. Heth Khan. Recalibration. Category Integration Development." Then I looked at Veth Karol, who had been watching this exchange from the front of the room and who had an expression I couldn't read. The secondary observer in the lead position, a Wraithy senior officer I'll call Assessor 1 because he never introduced himself, wrote something down. Veth Karol looked at the floor. I found him after the recruits cleared out. He was in the hangar, still, by the objective container, just standing there in the empty space. I have a policy about approaching instructors in their personal post-debrief processing time, which is, don't. I broke it. "The observers are from the evaluation board," I said. "I know. They're assessing your methodology." "I know." I waited. He said, "They saw the panel drill." "Yes. They're going to want to know if I'd seen that before. The distraction and flank sequence, whether it's something I taught." "Had you?" He looked at me. "No." I wrote, 11:04:33. Instructor. No prior instruction on panel drill technique. He watched me write it. I think he was glad I wrote it. There's something about having a witness who timestamps things. It makes certain facts more real. She was counting the vibrations, he said. Yes, from the start of the drill. He was quiet again. 19 seconds, he said. Her pause before she moved. Yes. She was waiting for the opposing team to fully commit to their position. Yes. So that moving them meant redirecting instead of just blocking. Yes, I think so. He exhaled. Not the quiet sound from week one, not that. When this was different. This was the sound of a calculation finishing. 6 years, he said. I've been running these drills for 6 years, and I've seen recruits distract, and I've seen recruits flank, and I've seen recruits use environmental features. He stopped. I have never seen a recruit use the gap between what the opposing team expects and what they've already committed to, as a structural element, as the actual substance of the plan. I wrote it down verbatim. He looked at me. You're writing this down? Yes. You timestamp everything? Yes. Why? I thought about the Yenar skirmish, the 4 missing hours, the debrief with empty hands. Because things that happen are real, I said, and then they become hard to prove. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, the blackout. Week 1. Yes? I cut it at 7 seconds. I know. You told me. I told you it wasn't deliberate. Yes. A pause. It was deliberate, he said. I just didn't realize it was deliberate until after I'd already done it. That's different from not meaning to. I looked at my notes, crossed out unintentional, wrote instinct. He said, those gloves. Yes. She said previous deployment. That's all she said. He nodded. He'd asked her too, I realized. He'd gotten the same 2 words. The left thumb seam wore through on the course, I said. She repaired it that evening. She said they're not rated for lateral pressure, but she uses them anyway because they slow her hands down. He absorbed this. Slows her hands down, he repeated. To keep her deliberate. She said when her hands move fast, it means she's panicking. He stood very still. She built herself a regulation mechanism, he said, out of a pair of gloves and 4 words written on a cuff. Yes. That she carries from deployment to deployment. Yes. He looked at the empty hangar. The evaluation board is going to ask me what I taught her. I said, tell them she arrived knowing it. He looked at me. Because she did, I said. What I can tell you, what I have logged to the second, and have time-stamped, and which exists in the compound record, is that Specialist Voss arrived at 6:02:14 with a bag that was too heavy for one person to carry casually, and she was carrying it casually, and she had a pair of gloves that she put on at 06:41:55 in the equipment bay. And they were already repaired and re-repaired and worn through at the left thumb, and she has been wearing them every day since. Pause. She didn't learn that here, I said. Whatever she learned somewhere else. What she learned here is that there are 19 seconds in a drill where the opposing team fully commits before recalculating, and that a ventilation panel with a consistent vibration interval is predictable, and that half a second of disorientation in a room full of people who've already decided they've won is more than enough. Veth Karal said, she counted the vibrations, from the moment she walked in. He was quiet for a long time. Then, what's written on the cuff? I told him. He closed his eyes, opened them, said, you know what the worst part is. I waited. I've been running this compound for 6 years, he said. I have course records. I have methodology notes. And I have 418 recruits in the compound log now, with 418 assessments. He paused. And I'm standing here trying to figure out how to explain to an evaluation board what I just watched happen in my own hangar. Because I don't have language for it. I looked at my notepad. I have language, I said. He looked at me. It's just timestamps, I said. But I have all of them. The evaluation board submitted their interim report 11 days later. I wasn't supposed to see it, I saw it because Dreyer has questionable information security practices and a compulsion to share things that alarm her, which in this case resulted in her standing in the canteen doorway at 22:04:17 with a data pad held out toward me, and an expression like she'd found something alive under her bunk. The relevant section read, Compound 7 demonstrates advanced integration metrics in cross-species adaptive training scenarios. Of particular note is the observed capacity of certain attached personnel to develop non-standard tactical frameworks without instructional scaffolding, suggesting pre-existing capability sets of interest to the board's ongoing assessment of integration training models. Recommend extended observation period. Recommend flag for operational deployment evaluation. Denote instruction methodology under Veth Corral demonstrates notable capacity to identify and respond to non-standard capability in real time. Board notes this as a positive indicator for adaptive instruction design. I read it twice. Then I wrote in my log, 2204:31. Evaluation Board Report, Interim. Voss flagged for deployment evaluation. Veth Corral, positive review. Then I wrote, the gloves are not in the report anywhere. I don't know why that bothered me. It does though. The last thing I'll record in this log about the gloves happened 4 days before the integration rotation ended. Voss was in the equipment bay. Again. Late evening. Again. The left thumb was holding. The repair from week 1 had survived 2 more drills, a full physical assessment, and 3 informal pickup scenarios that Veth Corral had started running in the evenings that no one was officially supposed to call extra training, but which everyone officially called extra training. And she wasn't repairing anything. She was just sitting with the gloves on the bench, looking at them. I sat across from her. We didn't say anything for a while. She said, "Where do you go next? After this rotation?" "Compound 12, I said. "New cohort. More integration assessment." "Yes?" She looked at the gloves. "Do any of them get it right?" she said. "The other species, in the assessments." I thought about Heth Khan, who had said temperature regulation and then hit a ventilation panel as hard as he could because someone he'd laughed at told him to. About Osivan, who had stood next to an objective with one hand raised, not touching it, because the not touching was more powerful than the touching. About Veth Corral, who had cut a 90-second blackout to 30 because at 7 seconds he already had what he needed. "Sometimes," I said. "Not right away, but sometimes." She nodded. "Well, what do you write about us?" she said. "In the logs." "Timestamps," I said. "What happened? When? Do you write what it means?" I looked at my notepad. "I try," I said. I don't always have the category." She picked up the gloves. "We had an instructor," she said, "back in primary training, before the deployment." She stopped. "He used to say that the most dangerous soldier isn't the one who's unafraid. It's the one who figured out what to do with the fear so it doesn't waste any motion." She put the gloves on, flexed her fingers, the familiar twice. "The gloves are the figuring out," she said. "That's all." Then she stood up, nodded once, and left. I stayed. Wrote 21/18/59. Subject, gloves. Functional. And then, for the first time in 11 years of integration observation, I couldn't make myself write a category. Some things are real, and then they become hard to prove. And some things you just timestamp and carry.